Alright, mate? You alright? What are we looking at? Oh, it's a good body. That's the Cardinal. Who's that like? Perhaps I can help. Who are you? Me. I'm the Dunc-In time.
This man is Cardinal David Beaton. Now, you might be wondering, why is this man interesting? Well, intuitive viewer, he was the last Scottish cardinal before the Scottish Reformation. A bit of a big deal if you know your European history. David Beaton was born in 1494 in Balfour into a middling noble family with some influential ties. His uncle, James Beaton, was the Archbishop of Glasgow. He'll come into our story a bit later down the line. David, however, started off his story by attending first St Andrews University, then Glasgow University, until, like most people his age nowadays, decided to travel the continent to find themselves. He moved to Paris at 16 to study law. During his stay in Paris, he managed to work his way up the social ladder until he found himself in the infamous politics of the French court. 10 years after he arrived in France, however, he was asked to come back to Scotland to become the rector of Cambuslang. He refused this offer, though, in favour of his nephew, but 2 years later he finally returned from France to take up a seat as Lord of Arbroath in the Scottish Parliament. His uncle at this point, James, had become the Archbishop of St Andrews, and soon after David arrived back in Scotland, young Dave was appointed the Archbishop of Arbroath, with the slight caveat that half of his salary goes back to his uncle. Ah, papal corruption. It wouldn't be the 16th century without it. With his uncle's influence and his French connections, David regularly was called upon to be the French ambassador to Scotland, even having a hand in setting up both of James V's marriages, first to Madeleine Valois, who sadly died of the old black lung, tuberculosis for those of you not from the Wild West, just 2 years after marrying James. Secondly, Mary of Guise, a year later. But then, James V suddenly went and died on campaign in 1542, leaving the 6-day-old Mary to take the throne. Beaton, now the Archbishop of St Andrews and the Cardinal of the whole of Scotland, appeared with a letter with the King's seal on it, declaring the Cardinal to be one of Mary's regents. This is believed to be the start of the mistrust in David felt by the Protestant half of the nobility, because they believed having this letter was just a little bit too convenient. Some even accused him of forging it. Now, I say the beginning of the mistrust, because this baby goes from 0 to 100 real fast, so buckle up. After he gained his new power, he got the shackles out and began to arrest Protestants left, right and centre on charges of heresy. Not only was that ticking off the Scottish Protestants, he was also accused of baiting Big Chops King Henry VIII himself into the rough wooing. He was also found out giving his illegitimate children well-paying positions in the Catholic Church. Who knew? For his second act, he imprisoned a friar called John Rogers and kept him in St Andrew's Castle, which was the cardinal's seat of power. This was just piling more kindling onto the bonfire of Scottish reformist unrest. In the Cardinal's infinite wisdom, he decided that the best way to quell this unrest was to arrest George Wishart, thought to have been John Knox's mentor, put him on a show trial, then burn him at the stake outside the Castle of St Andrews in good old Inquisition style. You can tell this just went down swimmingly with the Protestants, can't you? His life, along with his reign, ended with a little bit of bloody espionage. On the 26th of May, 1546, a group of Protestant Fifer lairds snuck into the Cardinal's castle disguised as masons, and murdered Beaton as he was getting out of bed. His corpse was hung out of a castle window, where it became a site of morbid pilgrimage for Protestants, but it wasn't to last. Soon after the assassination, Mary of Guise, her advisors, and another of the Queen's most influential regents, the Earl of Arran, laid siege to the castle, the lairds inside. The defenders, surprisingly, managed to hold out for a whole year, where they continuously sent out requests to King Henry of England to help, but eventually they surrendered the siege shortly after a French naval detachment appeared off the coast. Many of the defenders had died of either plague, starvation, or just the whole thing being a bit too much. The rest of the survivors were taken prisoner, split between the Scots and the French. Most notably, John Knox was taken as a French galley slave. This story can be seen as the beginning of the rise and support for Scottish Protestant reform, but I think the key points that you should take away from this are: Having an uncle that's absolutely loaded can really help, and if you don't want to annoy a group of people, don't kidnap one and burn them alive.